Hope you're doing okay with everything that's going on. Don't know exactly when this is going to go out, but right now it's been exactly a week since Boris Johnson started our lockdown in this country. So 7 days of isolation so far. And actually we'll talk about isolation today using the Bible, using some verses from Ephesians 2. And just before I read those verses, I want to say this is Paul speaking. He's writing to Gentiles and he's talking to them about what things were like before they were Christians. So they are Christians now, but this is before they were Christians, what things were like. So I'll read those verses. It's verses 12 to 16 in chapter 2. So remember that at that time, so before they were Christians, at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. Well, there is something unsettling, isn't there, about being isolated. We don't like the idea of being so far from people for who knows how long. It could be quite a while. Well, actually, Paul in this passage is saying to these Gentiles, you were really isolated. You were seriously isolated. There are three things. They are separate from Christ, they're excluded from citizenship in Israel, and they're foreigners to the covenants of the promise. And that's all in verse 12 that we've read there. And this is the ultimate isolation, surely. I don't know if you could be in a more hopeless situation. These people are isolated from fellow humans and they're isolated from God at the same time. So if being isolated in our homes today unsettles us, then how much more should it unsettle us to read this reminder of what Gentile Christians were before they were Christians? At that time they had neither hope nor God in the world. Well, why not spend some time praying for people that you know who fit that description? People without hope and without God in the world. Pray that this situation would show them their hopelessness and that God might use that to turn them to him. So the ultimately isolated Gentiles, they had two big problems. They were isolated from fellow humans and also isolated from God. Now, Paul says Jesus solved the first of those two problems. He made Jews and Gentiles, those two groups, he made them to be one group, destroying the barrier between those two groups in his death. So see the words in verse 13. Brought near by the blood of Christ, so it's in Jesus' death. Verse 15, setting aside in his flesh the law. It's all done by Jesus at the cross. And we used to be far away, but now we've been brought near. And it's all in Christ Jesus, no surprise there. He himself is our peace, it says, so we can take no credit at all. The first of the ultimately isolated Gentiles' problems, the two big problems, the first one's been made right in Jesus then. So let's thank God for the unity of the church in Christ. Even when we're temporarily, and of course to a much lesser degree, isolated physically, we're not ultimately isolated today. What about the second of those two problems then? Because the ultimately isolated Gentiles were also isolated from God. Well, once Christ had created that one new humanity of Gentiles and Jews together, he also reconciled that one humanity to God. And we've seen that the way he reunited humans, those two groups, was in his death. The way he reunited that one group to God was no different. It's through the cross, the passage says. Jesus wasn't just put to death, but the hostility between God and humanity was put to death too, allowing a way to peace with God through faith. So like I say, right now it's been only a week since Boris started that lockdown that we've got, and we have no idea really, do we, how long this is going to last. But actually here's a fantastic hope that will keep us going through however many weeks this isolation will be. Of course, today we are small-scale isolated, aren't we? But ultimately, if we're Christians, we're no longer isolated from one another, but we are one new humanity in Jesus. And we're no longer isolated from God either. We have peace with him.